What's up everybody, Couch Mills here, coming at you with a brand new Halo Infinite video, and in this video we're going to be breaking down the ultimate aiming guide. If you don't want to miss a shot and you want to win your 1v1s each and every time, this is the perfect in-depth guide for you. But the GameLeap website has in-depth aiming guides from top pro players, strategy courses, and decision-making guides, so if you want to climb to Onyx and above, you got to go check it out right now, down below. Now, before we even get started on aim, we need to talk about optimal settings. So this is going to be in two categories, the controller and the mouse and keyboard. Now, for controller, you need to split this up into two things, the micro adjustments and the larger adjustments. The micro adjustments are for very small movements by the enemy, very tiny bits of correction, and this should often be done with only your left stick, meaning that this type of aim is done with your movement rather than looking around. And then the larger adjustments, players are flying through the air, jumping around the corner, that is where your right stick comes in. That's where the larger adjustments get on point. You stabilize it towards where the enemy is with your right stick, and then from there, you have a minor adjustment duel with them with your left stick. This means that you don't have to lower down your sensitivity so low to where you can make micro adjustments with your right stick, because then the larger adjustments are going to be very difficult, if not impossible to do. Here's some important information breaking down all of the controller sensitivities for some of the top pro Halo Infinite players, from acceleration, horizontal to vertical sensitivity. Now, while the final sensitivity that you decide is going to be personal preference, it's important to reference what pros are doing, and the mean values of this is 4, 6, 6.5, so definitely keep that in mind when you're trying to find your optimal sensitivity. On top of that, make sure that you don't copy anyone's dead zone. Dead zone is designed to reduce stick drift and will be heavily controller dependent, so while you can definitely use someone's dead zone as a frame of reference, it's going to be a number that you're going to have to move around specific to your controller situation. As a last very important tidbit as far as controller is concerned, make sure that jumping does not remove your thumb from your right stick. This is one of the biggest problems with some controller layouts. If you have to take your thumb off of your thumbstick when you're jumping, it's going to be very hard for you to jump, turn a corner, and aim at the same time. So regardless of what your setup is, just make sure that you can jump and aim simultaneously. Now, next up, we got to talk about the optimal settings for mouse and keyboard. While we don't have any pro settings to reference for mouse and keyboard, as an Onyx player, I operate at the middle of the pack for most sensitivities at 800 DPI and 0.9 in game. Now, aiming is going to be heavily personal preference, with some people being more arm aimers and some people being wrist aimers. However, I will say for a game like Halo, you want to maximize control over the sporadic twitchiness that you would have in a game like Fortnite or playing a character like Genji in Overwatch. This means having full range of control from your arm to the big movements, your wrist to the smaller movements, and your fingers for the micro adjustment. If you put all the control in your wrist and fingers, you're essentially trying to paint a picture with only giving yourself 2 strokes rather than giving yourself 3 different paintbrushes of various sizes so that each of them can accomplish different aiming scenarios. Now, for lower sensitivities, I'm definitely going to suggest a large mouse pad so that you can still do 180s and flick around incredibly quickly, and I would also suggest a soft mouse pad. This allows you to artificially reduce your sensitivity when you're taking longer range fights by pushing into the soft mouse pad itself, creating artificial resistance. Now, there are some people that operate at a very high sensitivity, are wrist aimers, and operate on a hard pad or a very frictionless surface. And while these players could definitely make it work, they are very few and far between. Probably less than 1% of the players that develop really solid aim actually operate this way. So I'm not going to tell you to change if you're already having success with this style of aim. I wouldn't suggest anyone to follow suit and go down that road. Now, last up for mouse and keyboard, we do got to talk about the mouse itself. In general, a lighter weight mouse is better. You want to have the least amount of resistance between your hand movement and the actual input being moved on screen. This means that lighter is going to actually resist you the least. Now, that being said, a larger mouse can definitely stabilize your aim, and you could have success with it. However, this is an artificial stabilization that I think can be better achieved by a lower sensitivity and a solid, soft mouse pad with great resistance. As your last point, make sure that you have the least amount of buttons possible on your mouse. This is not a game where you want a million buttons like you're playing League of Legends and you have tons of hotkeys. The less buttons on your mouse, the better. Not only is it going to make your mouse lighter, but when you apply pressure anywhere on your mouse, it's going to inversely affect your aim, so you want to do it as little as possible. Next up, we're going to talk about fundamental aiming habits so that you can get the leg up on any 1v1 confrontation. Now, first off, let's talk about the proper way to peek. One of the biggest problems that players have is they sprint around way too often. There's a certain amount of time between you stopping your sprint and being able to fire, and oftentimes enemies are going to be able to get to the first shot on you. Now, this is incredibly important because it's about the transfer of damage. If the enemy gets the first shot on you and both of you are perfectly accurate from then on, the enemy is going to win that matchup, and that's actually actually why your first shot or getting the first shot on the enemy before they deal damage to you is so important in a proper gunfight. This means that instead of running around a corner, you actually are systematically peeking a corner, walking when you think an enemy could be around it so that you're already ready to fire at them the second that you see them. Now, on top of that, you can't afford to miss any sprays or else of course you're gonna lose, so aiming center of mass is optimal while the enemies still have shields. This means chest level so that the majority of your shots hit, and then your crosshair placement needs to be adjusted post the shield breaking. Now, speaking of crosshair placement, let's talk about proper crosshair placement because this is so important in Halo Infinite. Pre-aiming and scoping likely spots that enemies are holding is one of the best ways to get preliminary damage on them before they deal damage to you. As an example, imagine an enemy is in the balcony on streets. Now, this is what we call a power position, where enemies can peek multiple lanes leading to power weapons and objectives, so it's very likely that an enemy is there, and if they are there, they have an advantage against you in a direct fight, with the majority of their body being covered. Now, what you could do is peek out mid-space, and if an enemy is up there, you could flick up there and try to do damage to them, which could be okay. However, in the time frame where you have to move your crosshair to where the enemy is, they could already get first shot on you, and we just talked about how getting that first shot is so important. So you might be asking, what do you do instead? Instead, what you can do is push all the way up right before you're peeking the line of sight of that angle, and then swing out already scoped in, pre-aiming that spot with proper crosshair placement. Now, this makes it so that if there's an enemy there, you're already perfectly lined up, and all you have to do is fire at them, and you're gonna be able to get first shot on the enemy. This is gonna do several things. This is gonna deal damage to them first. This is gonna de-scope them, which is gonna make it very hard for them to potentially deal damage back to you, and it's gonna force the enemy into either a bad confrontation or force them out of said position. This is one of the most important aiming fundamentals that if you want to climb to the Onyx rank and above, you have to master each and every time. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about is the different types of peaks, because there's many different types of peaks, and let's break them down. First off is the jiggle peak, and a jiggle peak is a peak where you are just simply peeking out barely from cover, only like a foot out of cover. You could even fire at the enemy and then peek back. This means that you are very close to the cover, so if you start losing the duel, you could just run away, and you're constantly peeking out to get little bits of information, or even fade a shot like a sniper shot. Jiggle peeking is a great way to do that because as you peek out slightly, enemies might react to your peek with a shot, even though you're not full committing, and they'll end up missing. Now, the next type of peek is a wide swing or a Ferrari peek, and this is where you're actually swinging out as far as possible from your piece of natural cover. Now, there are pros and cons with this type of peek. The con is that you're leaving your natural cover by quite some margin, so if there are multiple enemies there firing on you, you could potentially die before you get back to cover out of the enemy's line of sight. Now, if you jiggle peeked preliminary and got information that there was only one target, a wide swing can allow you to really mess up that enemy's aim. They can have their crosshair right next to the wall, and then you swing outward so that they have to actually adjust their aim before they get to shoot at you, and before that, you are already pre-aiming where they are, so you're going to be able to get first shot on them or even overcome a damage disadvantage, and that's one of the great uses of a swing like this. Now, next up, we can have peeking like jump peeking, where it's very similar to a wide swing or a Ferrari peek, but you're jumping instead, which can also mess up an enemy's crosshair placement, especially if they're trying to aim head level and your head is all the way to the freaking skybox. And last up, there's slide peeking, which is where you get a running start and slide around the corner, which can be good, but it also can backfire depending on how the enemy is playing. Their crosshair might line up perfectly body level with your head. So if you have no shields up against a BR user, I wouldn't suggest slide peeking because you could be sliding directly into your death. Now, regardless of what type of peeking you're using, you need to think about this most of all. Where is an enemy likely to be aiming, and how do I mess up their crosshair placement in the way that I peek? Let me give you a perfect example. Let's say you are challenging an enemy and you keep jiggle peeking, the term we just talked about, out of a corner over and over again. You're jiggling out, you're firing, you're going back to cover. Out, fire, back to cover. And you keep doing that over and over again. The enemy is gonna put their crosshair right next to the wall, waiting for that peek to happen, so all they have to do is just fire on you the second they see you. In their mind, they're gonna have to move their crosshair almost none in order to shoot you if you do peek them, and that is where you execute like a wide swing or a jump peek. And now, all of a sudden, their crosshair placement is completely terrible for the type of peek you took. Understanding peeks as tools that you can utilize depending on what the enemy weapon is and depending on how they're holding in a certain engagement can really allow you to get the leg up on your competition, not only securing kills where you had an advantage without taking tons of damage, but even turning fights where enemies get first shot on you, but you still come back and win anyways using these type of peeks. Then last up, you need to realize that some peaks are going to be better or worse depending on the scenario. So let's talk about a jump swing, which is you running and jumping around a corner. That's going to be really good versus one person because that person might be completely messed up with their crosshair placement. You're going to get a lot of damage on them, and it's going to be hard for them to finish you off, get that headshot, when your head is really high up away from where they thought it would be. However, while it's good versus one person, it's going to be terrible versus three, because if there's three people and you're just jiggle peeking, if you see that there's three people, you can run away. You could go retreat. You could go back to your team. You could play your life. But if you're jump swinging, you're fully committing to that fight, and it gives you no runaway options, and you're probably going to die for free. So it's really important to think about these types of peaks as different tools that you could utilize, not ones that you should just do every single time, because there's optimal situations for each and every one of them. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about is aim and movement. First off, you need to understand that there's a relationship between movement and aim. Here it is in simple terms. The more you move equals the harder you are to hit, but the harder it is to aim. This means that while you have an advantage in damage on the enemy, it would be unwise for you to move sporadically, trying to reduce the damage at the cost of your own accuracy. This goes even more so for players needing that headshot. If you just need a final headshot on an enemy and you have pretty reasonable health, it doesn't make sense for you to be crouch spamming, moving left and right, sliding all over the place and jumping all over the place, when all you need to do is make sure that your accuracy is on point and you finish off that enemy with a single hit. Now, on top of that, this can definitely change depending on weaponry type. If the enemy has a much more lethal weapon, for instance, like a sniper rifle, no matter how low they are, if you give them a very easy headshot, they can win the matchup if even on paper, you have full HP and they have 5%. This means that if you have a huge advantage over a sniper user, all you want to do is make sure that they do not hit that headshot on you, and you're going to be able to easily win. But don't just walk up to them in a very static way, trying to maximize your aim to finish them off when they could turn around and get that headshot on you easily because your movement is not sporadic enough. Essentially, what I'm talking to here is the win condition. The win condition for them is hitting that headshot, and the win condition for you is making sure that they don't. So it's very important that you play around the enemy's one win condition, because on paper, you have a huge damage advantage. Now, from the other point of view, the takeaway for you is the more lethal you are, the less you want to hurt your aim, and the more you want to increase your accuracy. This means if you have something like a sniper rifle, you shouldn't be trying to move around like crazy, making yourself very hard to hit, and instead focusing more on making yourself more accurate so that you can hit the shots that you need to have the fight win condition. Now, the next very important thing we need to talk about is positioning, and you might be asking, what defines a good or bad position? Now, there are several things that define it. First off is information or line of sight on the battlefield. You have to have as much information as possible about the areas on the map, and the more areas you can see, the better the position is going to be. On top of that, you need the ability to defend objectives or defend the travel to and from objectives. So understanding the lines or the routes of travel between an objective and their ultimate goal. For instance, on a map like Aquarius, when we talk about capture the flag, if you control that high middle ground, you have control over all the lanes of fight. Not only that, you have ultimate information. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about is your natural cover. If you get fired from any direction, can you hide from that fire in a moment? If the answer is yes, then you have good natural cover and a good position. Also, are you weak to grenades? Being tucked into a little cubby might be strong from some types of fire, but you might be very weak to grenades, so definitely keep that in mind. Now, the last thing that you need to think about is your escapability. If enemies try to push you, how easy can you get out of that location and run away to safety? This is very important for where the enemy team gets tired of you and want to come in for a gangbang, and you need to get the hell out of there. As the ultimate takeaway for you, a strong position demands presence and response on the battlefield, but even if effort is spent on you, you'll be fine anyways. Essentially, you want a position where if enemies push you solo, they're going to be at a huge disadvantage, and if they have to send multiple people after you and you still get away, it fundamentally weakens their overall fighting force and give your teammates a huge advantage up against the remaining two players. Now, the GameLeap website is the best place to find in-depth advanced guides you won't find anywhere else. From aiming guides to strategy courses and more. If you want to climb to high onyx or chase the path to pro, go check it out right now down below.